He thought he was about to humiliate her in front of the entire lecture hall, but he had no idea he was seconds away from exposing his own greatest mistake. The auditorium at Westbridge University shimmered under bright white lights. Rows of graduate students seated shoulder to shoulder, laptops open, whispers fading as Professor Richard Harrington stepped to the front. His tailored navy suit, his silver hair, his reputation, it all commanded silence without effort. For years, he had built a name not just as a brilliant mathematician, but as a man who did not tolerate incompetence, someone who could dismantle a student's confidence with a single sentence. And today, he had already chosen his next example. In the back row, almost invisible among the crowd, sat Sarah Mitchell. Her gray cardigan looked worn at the sleeves, her notebook filled with careful handwriting rather than typed equations, her presence unnoticed by most. To them, she was just someone who didn't belong. Too quiet, too plain, too ordinary for a room filled with top-tier minds. But what they didn't see were the late nights, the years of silent study, the brilliance carefully hidden behind a life that demanded humility. Harrington's voice cut cleanly through the room as he began explaining a complex theorem, chalk gliding across the board with practiced precision. Each symbol seemed to reinforce his authority, each step layered with confidence that discouraged interruption. Yet halfway through, something shifted. A pause, a subtle hesitation, and from the back, a soft voice broke the rhythm. "Excuse me, wouldn't that transformation create an inconsistency in the boundary condition?" The words hung in the air like a challenge no one expected. Heads turned. A few students exchanged amused glances. Harrington slowly turned, his expression tightening just enough to reveal irritation. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Sarah. For a moment, silence stretched thin. Then came the faintest smile, not of curiosity, but of opportunity. "And you are?" he asked, his tone smooth but edged. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. "And your department?" A brief hesitation. "Facilities." A ripple of laughter spread across the room, subtle at first, then growing. Harrington nodded slowly, as if confirming a suspicion he already held. "Facilities," he repeated, letting the word linger as though it explained everything. He turned back to the board, then paused again, as if reconsidering something. The chalk tapped, once against the surface. Then he faced the room once more, eyes sharp now, calculating. "Well, Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a new weight, "since you seem to have insights into advanced mathematical theory, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate them." A few students leaned forward, sensing what was coming. Others smirked, already anticipating the outcome. Harrington stepped aside, gesturing toward the board. "Come up here," he added, casual but unmistakably commanding. The room shifted. The air grew heavier. Sarah didn't move at first. For a split second, doubt flickered across her face, the kind that comes from years of being underestimated, from knowing exactly how moments like this usually end. But then something else settled in. Not pride, not anger, just quiet certainty. She stood. The sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoed louder than it should have, each step drawing more attention, more expectation. As she reached the front, Harrington handed her the chalk with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. Behind her, the room held its breath, not in anticipation of brilliance, but of failure. And in that silence, just before the first mark touched the board, something shifted in a way none of them could yet understand. The chalk touched the board, and for a moment, nothing happened. Professor Harrington folded his arms, watching closely, his confidence unshaken, already certain of how this would end. A few students leaned back in their chairs, whispering under their breath, expecting hesitation, expecting confusion, expecting her to freeze under the pressure. But Sarah did not move like someone lost. She studied the equation for a brief second longer, her eyes scanning each symbol as if greeting something familiar rather than confronting something impossible. Then, without a word, she began. The first line appeared quickly, clean and deliberate, not rushed, not uncertain. A subtle shift moved through the room. The whispers softened. One student in the front row leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the board. Harrington's expression remained composed, but his gaze sharpened. Sarah continued, her hand steady, each step flowing into the next with quiet precision. There was no unnecessary movement, no pause to reconsider, no sign of doubt. It was as if she had already solved it long before she ever stepped up there. The sound of chalk against the board became the only thing anyone could hear. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. A student who had been smirking moments ago slowly straightened in his seat. Another closed her laptop, eyes fixed on the unfolding solution. The room was changing, but no one said it out loud. Harrington shifted his weight slightly, his arms uncrossing without him noticing. His eyes moved from her face to the board, then back again, as if searching for a flaw that had not yet appeared. Sarah reached the midpoint of the equation, and something unexpected happened. Instead of following the conventional path, she adjusted the approach. A cleaner substitution. A more efficient transformation. Subtle, but unmistakable to those who understood. The shift rippled through the room like a quiet shock. A professor seated near the aisle leaned forward, his brows pulling together. He whispered something to the colleague beside him, who did not respond, too focused on what was unfolding. Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He stepped closer, just one step, as if proximity might reveal an error that distance had hidden. But the lines kept forming, each one reinforcing the last, each step locking into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Sarah did not look back at the audience. She did not glance at Harrington. She simply continued, her focus unbroken, her presence steady in a way that no longer matched the image they had assigned to her. The final sequence approached, the part that usually broke even the strongest students. The part Harrington had expected to expose her. The room held its breath. And then, without hesitation, she completed it. The last symbol settled onto the board with a soft, final stroke. The equation stood there, complete, balanced, undeniable. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence as before. This one carried weight. No one laughed. No one whispered. Harrington stared at the board, his mind racing behind stillness, scanning each line, each transformation, searching for the mistake that should have been there. But the longer he looked, the more the realization pressed in. Not only was it correct, it was refined, improved, cleaner than his own presentation. A student near the back exhaled slowly, as if only just remembering to breathe. Another shook his head in disbelief. The professor near the aisle leaned back, eyes wide, no longer whispering. Sarah stepped back from the board, placing the chalk down gently on the tray. For the first time since she had begun, she lifted her gaze. Not to the crowd, not to the room, but directly to Harrington. And in that quiet moment, something shifted again, something deeper than surprise, something that could not be undone. Because what stood on that board was not just an answer. It was a statement. And Harrington had not yet realized what it was about to cost him. Harrington did not speak at first, and that silence stretched longer than anyone in the room expected. His eyes remained fixed on the board, scanning every line again, slower this time, more carefully, as if the answer might change if he looked long enough. But it did not. It stayed there, precise and undeniable, each step locking into the next with a clarity that refused to break. A faint murmur began somewhere in the middle rows, quickly hushed, as if the room itself understood that something significant was unfolding. Harrington cleared his throat, the sound sharper than intended, and finally turned towards Sarah, his expression carefully reconstructed into something resembling control. "Interesting," he said, though the word felt smaller than the moment demanded. He stepped closer to the board, lifting the chalk again, tapping lightly against one section of her solution. "You have followed a non-standard approach here," he continued, his tone measured, searching for authority he could still hold on to. "Explain your reasoning." It was not a question. It was a challenge, one last attempt to regain ground. The room shifted again, attention snapping back to Sarah. This was the moment where most would falter, where confidence would crack under scrutiny. But Sarah did not rush. She took a single breath, her gaze moving briefly to the section he indicated, and then back to him. "The traditional substitution introduces unnecessary complexity," she said calmly, her voice steady but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "By redefining the variable earlier, you reduce the system before the constraint is applied." A pause followed, not from uncertainty, but from precision. "It eliminates the inconsistency before it forms." The words landed differently than anything said before. Not defensive, not hesitant, just correct. Harrington's fingers tightened slightly around the chalk. He turned back to the board, following her explanation step by step, his eyes moving faster now, trying to catch up to a logic that was already complete. Another professor stood from his seat near the aisle, unable to remain still any longer. "She is right," he said quietly, though the silence made it carry. Several heads turned toward him. He gestured toward the equation. "That adjustment removes the instability in the final phase. It is more efficient." The confirmation settled over the room like a final seal. Harrington did not respond immediately. For a man who had spent years commanding every discussion, every answer, every room, this was unfamiliar territory. His authority had always come from certainty, and certainty was slipping. Sarah remained where she stood, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, as if none of this surprised her. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Because she was not reacting to the moment. She had expected it. The realization crept in slowly, but once it arrived, it did not leave. Harrington looked at her again, really looked this time, not as an interruption, not as an inconvenience, but as something he had failed to recognize. "Where did you study?" he asked, the question quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. A simple question, but one that carried weight. The room leaned in. Sarah held his gaze for a second, then glanced briefly at the board, as if considering whether the answer even mattered. "I did not finish," she said. A flicker of confusion passed through several faces. Harrington frowned slightly. "Did not finish?" he repeated. Sarah nodded once. "Life changed," she added, not elaborating, not needing to. The simplicity of the statement contrasted sharply with everything that had just happened. A student near the front shook his head slowly, disbelief still written across his face. "That is not possible," he whispered under his breath, though he did not realize he had spoken aloud. But Sarah had already turned slightly, her attention no longer fixed on Harrington, no longer tied to the need to prove anything. She had done that the moment she picked up the chalk. Harrington looked back at the board one last time, and for the first time, he saw it not as his lecture, not as his domain, but as something that had been taken from him in a way he could not reverse. The equation no longer belonged to him, and neither did the room. Because in that quiet, undeniable shift, everyone present understood something he had not prepared for. The woman he had chosen to expose had just revealed something far greater, and he had been the one who invited her to do it. The room did not return to normal, because something fundamental had already shifted, something no one could pretend had not happened. Professor Harrington remained at the front, but the invisible line that once separated authority from audience had dissolved, and he could feel it in the way the room no longer leaned toward him. It leaned toward her. He adjusted his stance, placing the chalk down with more care than before, buying himself a moment to think, to regain control of a situation that had quietly slipped beyond it. "Mathematics," he began, his voice steady but carrying a different weight now, "is not just about arriving at the correct answer." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the board, as if reframing the narrative. "It is about rigor, about understanding the framework behind each decision." The words were familiar, almost rehearsed, but they did not land the same way. Not after what everyone had just witnessed. Sarah did not respond immediately. She stood calmly, her hands resting at her sides, her expression unchanged, as if she had already stepped beyond the need to defend herself. A student near the front raised his hand halfway, then lowered it again, unsure if it was still appropriate to speak. Another student whispered. She solved it faster than anyone here could, but this time, the whisper carried admiration instead of amusement. Harrington heard it. Of course he did. He heard everything now. And that was the problem. Because for the first time in years, he was not controlling the narrative inside his own lecture hall. He turned back to Sarah, studying her with a focus that no longer dismissed her. "If you did not complete your formal education," he said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "then where did you develop this level of understanding?" It was a question layered with more than curiosity. It was an attempt to place her, to categorize her, to restore order to something that felt out of place. Sarah's gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching for approval, not seeking validation, simply observing. Then she looked back at him. "I kept studying," she said. The simplicity of the answer created another pause. Harrington frowned slightly. "On your own?" he asked. She nodded once. "At night." After work. Whenever I could. A faint shift moved through the room again. But this time it was not shock. It was recognition. Students who had once dismissed her now saw something else entirely. Discipline. Persistence. Something they understood, but rarely saw expressed so quietly. Harrington inhaled slowly, processing more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years believing that brilliance followed a certain path, that recognition required validation, that expertise needed credentials to exist. And yet, standing in front of him was proof that those assumptions were incomplete. Still, something in him resisted. It was not arrogance alone. It was the weight of everything he had built his identity on. Theory without structure can lead to inconsistency, he said, though the conviction behind the statement felt thinner now. Sarah tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in consideration. Structure matters, she replied. But so does seeing where it can be simplified. She glanced toward the board. Sometimes the complexity is not in the problem. It is in how we choose to approach it. The words settled deeper than anything she had said before, because they were not just about mathematics. And everyone in the room knew it. A professor near the back gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A student who had laughed earlier now stared at the floor, replaying the moment in his mind. Harrington remained still, his expression controlled, but his silence spoke louder than any argument he could have made. For the first time, he was not searching for a way to respond. He was searching for a way to understand. Sarah took a small step back, creating space, not as an act of retreat, but as an acknowledgement that she had already said what needed to be said. The equation behind her remained unchanged, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer just a problem solved. It was a line drawn between assumption and reality. Harrington looked at it again, and this time, he did not see his lecture. He saw the moment it stopped being his. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer tense. It was reflective, almost reverent, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed something rare. Not just intelligence, but clarity. And in that clarity, something else had quietly taken hold, something Harrington could not ignore any longer. Because the woman he had tried to define had just redefined the entire room without raising her voice. No one spoke, but the silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to realization, and that realization was spreading faster than anyone could stop it. Professor Harrington stood still at the front of the room. The man who had built his entire reputation on being the sharpest mind in any space, now facing something he could not easily measure or control. His eyes drifted once more to the board, then back to Sarah, and for the first time, there was no trace of dismissal left in his expression, only a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted beyond his reach. A student in the second row slowly closed his notebook, not because the lecture was over, but because it no longer felt like a lecture at all. Another leaned back, exhaling as if releasing a tension he had not realized he was holding. The room had changed, and everyone could feel it. Harrington finally spoke, but his voice carried a different tone now, one stripped of performance, almost reflective. There is a difference, he said slowly, between knowing how to solve a problem and understanding why it works. The statement sounded like an attempt to reclaim ground, but it lacked the certainty that once defined it. Sarah did not challenge him. She did not interrupt. She simply listened, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, as if she had already moved past the need to prove anything further. Harrington took a step closer, gesturing lightly toward the equation. Most people spend years trying to reach this level, he continued, though now his words seemed directed as much to himself as to the room. And yet you. He stopped, the sentence unfinished, because for once, he did not have the answer ready. Sarah glanced briefly at the board, then back at him. Understanding does not always come from where people expect, she said quietly. Her voice was not loud, but it carried through the room with clarity that did not require volume. Sometimes it comes from having to figure things out when no one is there to explain them. A few students exchanged glances, the meaning of her words settling in deeper than the mathematics itself. Harrington's gaze lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in thought, as if he was seeing something he had overlooked for a very long time. He had spent years teaching from a position of authority, assuming that knowledge flowed in one direction, that expertise was something granted by systems, by institutions, by titles. But standing in front of him was a contradiction to all of that, a quiet reminder that understanding could exist without recognition, that brilliance did not always announce itself in the ways he had learned to trust. The room remained still, but the energy had shifted again, softer now, more reflective. The earlier tension had dissolved into something else, something closer to respect. Not just for Sarah, but for the idea she represented. Harrington straightened slightly, his composure returning, but it was different this time, less rigid, less guarded. "You have an unconventional perspective," he said, and though the words might once have sounded dismissive, now they carried a note of sincerity. Sarah offered a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. She did not need to expand on it. The truth had already been demonstrated. A professor near the back of the room finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Innovation rarely follows a conventional path," he said, looking between Harrington and Sarah. "Sometimes it appears where we least expect it." The statement lingered, reinforcing what everyone already understood but had not yet voiced. Harrington did not argue. He could not. Because the evidence was still there on the board, unchanging, undeniable. He looked at it one last time, and this time, he allowed himself to see it fully, not as a challenge to his authority, but as something he could learn from. The realization was quiet, but it was real. Sarah stepped back another small pace, not retreating, but creating distance from the moment, as if she was already preparing to leave it behind. She had never come into the room to take anything from anyone. She had simply responded when called. And now, with nothing left to prove, she no longer needed to stay. The room watched her, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with something that had not been there before. Respect. And as that realization settled into every corner of the lecture hall, one truth became impossible to ignore. The person they had almost overlooked had just redefined the meaning of presence, without raising her voice, without demanding attention, simply by being exactly who she was. The moment should have ended there, but something in the room refused to let it pass so easily, as if everyone present understood that what had just happened was not meant to fade quietly into the next lecture. Professor Harrington stood still for a second longer, then slowly turned away from the board, facing the audience not as a man delivering knowledge, but as someone recalibrating in real time. His usual rhythm, the sharp precision of his voice, the controlled pacing of his lectures, all of it had been interrupted, and now he had to decide how to continue in a room that no longer saw him the same way. A student near the center raised his hand, hesitant at first, then more certain. "Professor," he said carefully, "could you explain why her method removes the instability faster?" The question was simple, but it carried weight, because it was no longer about reinforcing Harrington's authority, it was about understanding her reasoning. The shift was undeniable. Harrington paused, just briefly, then nodded. He turned back to the board, studying Sarah's work once more, this time not searching for a mistake, but following it as a student would. "The early variable adjustment," he said slowly, tracing the step with his finger, "reduces the cascading effect before it compounds." He stopped, then added, almost reluctantly, "It simplifies the structure before the constraint is applied." The words sounded different coming from him now, less declarative, more observational. The room listened closely, absorbing not just the explanation, but the change in tone. Sarah remained near the front, not stepping forward, not stepping away, simply present, as if the moment no longer required her to act. Another student spoke up, more confident this time. "So it is not just correct," she said, "it is better." A faint ripple of agreement moved through the room. Harrington did not immediately respond. He looked at the equation again, then at the students, then finally at Sarah. There was no easy way to avoid the truth now. "Yes," he said quietly. "In this case, it is." The admission settled heavily, not as a loss, but as a turning point. Because in a room built on intellect, acknowledging a better solution was not weakness, it was integrity. And yet, it was also something Harrington had rarely been forced to do so publicly. A professor seated along the side aisle leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice respectful, "have you ever considered returning to formal study?" The question hung in the air, drawing every eye back to her. It was no longer curiosity. It was invitation. Sarah hesitated for the first time since stepping to the board, not out of uncertainty, but out of reflection. Her gaze moved briefly across the room, taking in the faces that now looked at her differently, then back to the equation that had changed everything in less than a minute. I have thought about it, she said honestly. But life does not always follow the path you plan. The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet depth that made several students lower their eyes, recognizing something personal within it. Harrington watched her closely, and for the first time, there was no distance in his gaze, no barrier of assumption. Paths can change, he said, his voice steadier now, but no longer authoritative in the same way. Sometimes unexpectedly. Sarah met his eyes, and for a brief moment, there was something unspoken between them, not conflict, not agreement, but understanding. The kind that only appears after something has been broken and quietly rebuilt in a different form. A student in the back, the same one who had laughed earlier, now spoke in a softer tone. I think we just saw what real understanding looks like. No one laughed this time. No one dismissed it. Because it was true. The room had witnessed more than a solution. It had witnessed a shift in perspective, a quiet redefinition of what it meant to belong in a space like this. Harrington exhaled slowly, then turned back to the board one final time. Class, he said, his voice calm, grounded. Take a moment to review this approach. He stepped aside, not just physically, but symbolically, giving the space over to something greater than his own instruction. Sarah remained where she was for a second longer, then gently stepped back, blending once again into the space she had occupied before, but nothing about her presence was invisible anymore. The room did not move immediately. No one rushed to pack their things. No one broke the silence. Because in that stillness, one truth had settled into every mind present, something that would not fade when the lecture ended. The person they had overlooked had not just solved a problem. She had quietly changed the standard by which they understood one. The lecture did not end when the clock said it should, because no one reached for their bags, no one checked their phones, and no one wanted to be the first to break the quiet understanding that had settled over the room. Instead, students remained seated, their attention still anchored to the front, to the board, and to the woman who had quietly changed everything without ever asking for it. Professor Harrington stood slightly off to the side now, no longer occupying the center as he once did, his posture composed but undeniably different. He watched as a few students slowly stood, not to leave, but to move closer to the board, studying the solution line by line as if trying to understand not just how it worked, but how they had missed it. That substitution, it simplifies everything. One student murmured, tracing the logic with his finger in the air. Another nodded, her voice filled with disbelief that had turned into admiration. It is so obvious once you see it. Sarah remained near the edge of the front row, her presence calm, almost detached from the attention now surrounding her. She did not step forward to explain further, did not try to guide the discussion, because she did not need to. The work spoke for itself. A young woman approached cautiously, her expression respectful. Ms. Mitchell, she said, her voice softer than before. How did you know to approach it that way? Sarah looked at her, considering the question, not dismissing it, but also not overcomplicating the answer. I have seen problems like this before, she said simply. Different forms, different contexts. Patterns repeat if you look long enough. The student nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, realizing that what sounded simple carried years of effort behind it. Across the room, Harrington watched the interaction, his mind still processing the shift that had taken place, not just in the room, but within himself. He had spent years believing that expertise required recognition, that authority defined value. And yet here stood someone who had none of the titles he respected, but all of the understanding he valued. The contradiction was no longer something he could ignore. He took a step forward, drawing the room's attention back to him, though this time it came without force. Ms. Mitchell, he said, his voice steady, but no longer distant, would you be willing to walk us through your reasoning in more detail? The request was simple, but its meaning was not. It was not a command. It was not a test. It was an acknowledgement. The room grew still again, waiting. Sarah hesitated for a brief moment, not out of fear, but out of habit, the instinct to remain unseen still lingering even after everything that had just happened. But then she nodded. She stepped forward once more, not with hesitation this time, but with quiet assurance. She picked up the chalk again, turning back to the board, and began to speak, her voice calm, her explanation clear, breaking down each step with a simplicity that made the complex feel approachable. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply shared what she understood. And as she did, something remarkable happened. The room leaned in, not because they were being taught, but because they wanted to understand. Even Harrington listened without interruption, following each step as if hearing it for the first time, his usual instinct to correct or challenge replaced by something else entirely. Respect. When she finished, she set the chalk down once more, stepping back without waiting for approval, without expecting anything in return. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with recognition, with realization, with something that had not been there before. A student began to clap, hesitantly at first, then more confidently. Another joined. And then, slowly, the entire room followed, the sound building not out of obligation, but out of genuine acknowledgement. Sarah stood still, not smiling, not reacting, simply receiving the moment without holding on to it. Harrington did not clap immediately. He watched her, his expression thoughtful, then slowly brought his hands together, not as a gesture of performance, but as a quiet acceptance of what had just occurred. Because in that moment, the hierarchy he had always relied on no longer mattered. What mattered was truth. And the truth was standing right in front of him, no longer invisible, no longer underestimated, and impossible to ignore. The applause did not fade quickly, because it was not just a reaction, it was a release, a shift that had been building from the moment Sarah first touched the chalk to the board, and now it echoed through the room with a sincerity no one could fake. Students, who had once avoided looking in her direction, now watched her with open admiration, their expressions no longer guarded by assumptions but shaped by respect. Sarah stood quietly as the sound gradually softened, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that made the moment feel both extraordinary and completely natural at the same time. She did not raise her hands, did not nod for acknowledgement, did not step forward to claim anything. She simply existed within the moment, and somehow that made it even more powerful. Professor Harrington let the applause settle before he moved, his steps slower now, more deliberate, as if each one carried weight he had not felt before. He approached the board, then paused, turning slightly toward Sarah. For a brief second, it seemed as though he might speak, might attempt to reclaim the space with something definitive, something that would restore the balance he had always maintained. But the words did not come the way they once had. Instead, what came was something quieter, something more honest. "Thank you," he said. The room stilled again, not because the words were loud, but because of what they represented. Harrington, the man who rarely acknowledged anyone in such a way, had just done so without hesitation. Sarah met his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not as acceptance of praise, but as acknowledgement of respect. Around them, the students began to shift, some returning to their seats, others still lingering near the board, unwilling to let the moment pass too quickly. Conversations started in low tones, but they were different now, filled with curiosity rather than judgment. "She saw it immediately," one student said. "Not immediately," another corrected softly. "She has probably been seeing things like that for years." The distinction mattered, and more people were beginning to understand it. Harrington turned back to the board, studying the solution once more, but this time not as a teacher evaluating a student, but as a mind encountering something new. He picked up the chalk again, hesitated, then added a small notation beside Sarah's work, not to change it, but to highlight a connection he had not considered before. The gesture was subtle, but it carried meaning. He was no longer correcting. He was learning. Sarah watched briefly, then shifted her attention away, her role in the moment already complete. She stepped back further, moving toward the side of the room, her presence becoming quieter again, but not invisible. Not anymore. A professor approached her, his expression thoughtful, his tone respectful. "You have a remarkable mind," he said. "The university would benefit from it." Sarah smiled faintly, not dismissing the compliment, but not holding on to it either. "Understanding does not belong to a place," she replied gently. "It travels with you." The professor considered her words, then nodded slowly, as if recognizing something he had not fully appreciated before. Across the room, Harrington turned once more, his gaze following her as she stepped further away from the center. There was something in his expression now that had not been there before. Not just respect, but humility. The kind that does not come from being told, but from experiencing something that cannot be undone. He had spent years shaping others, measuring them against standards he believed were absolute. And in a single moment, those standards had been expanded in a way he could not ignore. The room gradually began to return to motion, students gathering their things, voices rising slightly, but the energy remained different, quieter, more thoughtful. No one rushed out. No one treated it like an ordinary end to a lecture. Because it was not. As Sarah reached the aisle, one student stepped aside to let her pass. A small gesture, but one that carried recognition. Another gave a nod. A third offered a quiet, thank you. Not for the answer, but for what she had shown them. Sarah acknowledged each with the same calm presence, never lingering, never seeking more. She moved toward the exit without hesitation, her steps steady, her expression unchanged. And as she reached the doorway, the light from the hallway framed her for just a moment, a quiet contrast to the room she was leaving behind. Behind her, Professor Harrington stood at the front, the board still marked with her solution, the room still holding the echo of what had taken place. He looked at the equation one last time, then toward the door where she had just stepped through. And in that silent space between what had been and what now was, one realization settled fully into place. The lesson that day had not come from the one who was expected to teach. And the person they had almost overlooked had just redefined what it meant to truly understand. The hallway outside the lecture hall felt quieter than it should have, as if the world beyond those doors had not yet caught up to what had just taken place inside. Sarah walked at her usual pace, neither hurried nor slow, her steps steady against the polished floor, the same way she had walked every day before this moment existed. Students passed by without noticing her at first, but something subtle began to change. A glance that lingered half a second longer. A pause before stepping aside. A recognition forming where there had once been none. Behind her, inside the lecture hall, Professor Harrington remained standing long after most of the students had left, his gaze fixed on the board where her solution still remained untouched. He could have erased it. He could have moved on, continued the lecture as if nothing had happened. But he did not, because erasing it would not erase what it represented. A young student approached him cautiously, holding a notebook close to his chest. "Professor," he said, his voice respectful but curious, "will we be studying that method more?" Harrington looked at the board again, then at the student, and for a moment, the answer he would have given yesterday felt distant. "Yes," he said finally, his voice calm, grounded in something new. "We will." The student nodded, satisfied, and walked away, leaving Harrington alone with the equation and the realization it carried. For years, he had believed that knowledge flowed in a single direction, from those who held authority to those who sought it. But today had shown him something different. Something quieter, but far more powerful. That understanding could appear where it was least expected, and that recognizing it required more than intelligence. It required humility. Back in the hallway, Sarah reached the exit doors and stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. The sunlight stretched across the campus lawn, students gathering in small groups, conversations continuing, life moving forward as it always did. She paused for a brief moment, not to reflect, not to hold on to what had happened, but simply to take in the quiet before continuing. A voice called out behind her, "Ms. Mitchell." She turned slightly to see the same professor who had spoken during the lecture approaching her, his expression thoughtful, his steps measured. "I hope you will consider returning," he said, his tone sincere. "There are opportunities here for someone like you." Sarah listened, her expression calm, then offered a small, understanding smile. "Thank you," she replied. "But I never stopped learning." The professor nodded, as if realizing that the path he was offering was not the only one that mattered. He did not press further. He simply stepped back, allowing her to continue. Sarah walked down the path leading away from the building, her figure gradually blending into the rhythm of the campus, no longer standing at the center of attention, but no longer invisible either. Behind her, the lecture hall door opened once more, and Harrington stepped out, his eyes scanning the walkway until they found her in the distance. He did not call out. He did not interrupt. He simply watched for a moment, taking in the quiet certainty with which she moved forward. Then, almost unconsciously, he spoke, not loudly, not to be heard, but as a truth he could no longer deny. Respect is not given by position, he murmured, his voice steady. It is revealed through understanding. The words lingered in the air, carried only by the silence around him. Sarah did not turn back. She did not need to, because what had been proven did not require acknowledgement. It simply existed. And as the afternoon light stretched across the campus, one truth remained, clear and unshakable. The person they had once overlooked had not just solved a problem. She had changed the way they would see every problem that came after.